What happens when a single sentence spoken from the audience seats shatters 30 years of family silence? Dr. Phil's hand shot up toward the cameras. Stop the tape. The words cut through the studio like a blade. Every camera operator froze. The audience held its breath. And in that moment of absolute silence, everyone understood that what they had just heard would change everything. But how did we get to this moment? And what secret was so devastating that it stopped production on the Dr. Phil show? It started like any other Tuesday taping. The episode was titled, Family Fractures, When Siblings Stop Speaking. On stage sat two sisters, Jennifer and Rebecca Martinez, who hadn't spoken in 12 years. The audience settled into their seats, expecting the usual family drama, disputes over inheritance, old childhood grudges, maybe a betrayal or two. Jennifer, 47, sat rigidly in her chair, arms crossed defensively. She wore a navy blazer and kept her eyes fixed on a spot somewhere above Dr. Phil's head, refusing to look at her younger sister. Rebecca, 42, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue even before the cameras started rolling. She wore a simple gray cardigan and kept glancing hopefully toward Jennifer, searching for any sign of softening. Dr. Phil walked onto the stage with his characteristic confidence, clipboard in hand, ready to mediate another family conflict. The studio lights brightened. The cameras rolled. So Jennifer, Dr. Phil began, settling into his chair with that direct gaze that had become his trademark. You haven't spoken to your sister in over a decade. Help me understand what happened that was so terrible that it severed this relationship. Jennifer's jaw tightened. She knows what she did. Nobody in that studio knew they were about to witness something unprecedented. Rebecca leaned forward, her voice breaking. Jenny, I've apologized 1,000 times. I made a mistake. I dated your ex-boyfriend after you broke up. It was wrong, but it was 12 years ago. He and I aren't even together anymore. Dr. Phil nodded, taking notes. This was familiar territory. Sibling betrayal over a romantic relationship. Painful, but solvable. Jennifer, your sister is taking accountability. Dr. Phil said, his voice measured and therapeutic. She's acknowledging the hurt. What would it take for you to consider forgiveness? Jennifer's laugh was bitter and cold. Forgiveness? She wants forgiveness? Her hands gripped the armrests until her knuckles turned white. That's not even why I stopped talking to her. The studio went quiet. Rebecca's face drained of color. Then what is it? Dr. Phil asked, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. What Jennifer said next would become one of the most talked about moments in the show's history. She knows why, Jennifer said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. She knows what she did to our mother. Rebecca shook her head frantically. I don't know what you're talking about. Stop lying! Jennifer's voice cracked, years of suppressed rage finally breaking through. I know you changed Mom's medication before she died. I know you switched the bottles. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Dr. Phil straightened in his chair, his expression shifting from therapeutic curiosity to something harder, more alert. Hold on, Dr. Phil said, raising one hand. That's a very serious allegation, Jennifer. Are you saying? I'm saying she killed our mother, Jennifer said, and the studio erupted into gasps. Rebecca was on her feet, shaking, her face flushed red. That's insane! Mom died of a heart attack, the doctors said. The doctors said it could have been prevented if she'd had her correct medication, Jennifer shot back. And I found the bottles, Rebecca. I found them in your apartment after the funeral. Mom's real pills in your bathroom cabinet, and the cheap generics you replaced them with. Dr. Phil did something he rarely did. He looked directly into the camera and gestured to his production team. Stop the tape, he said firmly. Cut cameras. The red recording lights on all 4 studio cameras blinked off. Producers rushed onto the stage. The audience sat frozen, unsure if they should look away, unsure if this was part of the show or something much more real. Dr. Phil stood and moved between the two sisters, his voice low but commanding. "Ladies, we're going off the record here. Jennifer, these are allegations that go beyond family drama. This is potential criminal negligence. Do you have evidence to support this?" Jennifer nodded, reaching into her purse. She pulled out a wrinkled pharmacy receipt and 2 prescription bottles, setting them on the small table between the chairs. What happened in the next 5 minutes would never be broadcast, but everyone in that studio would remember it forever. Dr. Phil picked up the bottles carefully, reading the labels. His jaw tightened. He turned to one of his producers, a woman named Lisa who had been with the show for 8 years. "Lisa, I need you to call our legal team right now. And get Tom from security." He looked at Rebecca, and his voice was no longer the warm therapeutic tone he used for the cameras. It was the voice of someone who had seen too much human darkness to be shocked anymore, but who still believed in accountability. "Rebecca, I need you to be very honest with me right now. Not for the cameras, not for the audience, but because this has crossed a line that I cannot ignore. Did you switch your mother's medication?" Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Rebecca's legs gave out. She sank back into her chair, her hands covering her face. For a long moment, she said nothing. The entire studio waited. "I didn't mean for her to die," Rebecca whispered finally, her voice so small that even the front row of the audience had to strain to hear. I was struggling. The rent was due, and I had lost my job, and Mom's medications were so expensive. I thought if I just used the cheaper versions for a few months until I got back on my feet." Jennifer let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. "You killed her to save money? I didn't know it would kill her." Rebecca's voice rose in desperation. "The pharmacist said they were basically the same thing. Generic is supposed to be just as good." Dr. Phil's voice cut through like steel. "Generic medications are chemically equivalent when prescribed properly and with physician oversight. But your mother had a complex cardiac condition that required precise dosing and specific formulations. You made a medical decision without medical knowledge, and it had fatal consequences." He turned to the audience, even though the cameras were off. This was the moment that would later be described by those present as the most real thing they'd ever seen on television. "I'm going to tell you something. Dr. Phil said, and the authority in his voice made even the production staff stop moving. "In 30 years of doing this work, I've seen families torn apart by addiction, by abuse, by betrayal. But this," he gestured to the prescription bottles on the table. "This is what happens when desperation meets rationalization. When someone convinces themselves that a shortcut won't have consequences." He looked at Rebecca, and his expression held something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite condemnation. It was the look of someone who understood human weakness but refused to excuse it. "Rebecca, you need legal counsel immediately. What you did, whether you intended harm or not, resulted in your mother's death. That's a matter for law enforcement and the courts, not for this stage." Rebecca was crying so hard now that her whole body shook. "I never meant. I just thought. I loved my mother." "I believe you did," Dr. Phil said quietly. "But love doesn't undo consequences. And your sister deserves to know the truth, and your mother deserves justice." But what nobody expected was what happened next. From the third row of the studio audience, a woman stood up. She was perhaps 65, with silver hair and glasses, wearing a simple floral dress. She raised her hand tentatively. "Dr. Phil?" Her voice was soft but clear. "May I say something?" Every head in the studio turned toward her. Dr. Phil nodded slowly. "Go ahead." The woman took a breath. "My name is Carol Brennan. I'm a retired pharmacist. And I need to tell you something about those medications." She stepped forward, moving toward the stage with careful, deliberate steps. Dr. Phil gestured for her to approach. "I worked at Fletcher's Pharmacy in Scottsdale for 32 years, Carol said, her voice gaining strength. "And 15 years ago, I made the exact same mistake Rebecca made. The studio went completely silent. My father had Parkinson's disease. His medications cost almost $800 a month. I was drowning in debt. And I worked at a pharmacy, so I convinced myself I knew enough to make substitutions. Carol's eyes filled with tears. My father died 3 months later from complications that might have been prevented. And I've lived with that knowledge every single day since. She looked directly at Rebecca. I see myself in you. The desperation, the rationalization, the belief that you were smart enough to figure it out. But we weren't doctors. We were desperate people who made catastrophic decisions. Dr. Phil's expression softened slightly, and he gestured for Carol to sit in one of the audience chairs that had been brought onto the stage. Carol, why are you sharing this now? He asked gently. Because Rebecca needs to understand 2 things, Carol said, her voice steady despite the tears. First, she will never forgive herself, and she shouldn't try to. That guilt is appropriate. It's earned. And it's a weight she'll carry forever. Rebecca looked up, her face devastated. But second, Carol continued, she can choose what to do with that weight. I spent 5 years in a depression so deep I didn't leave my house. And then one day, I decided that if I couldn't undo what I did to my father, I could at least try to prevent others from making the same mistake. From her purse, Carol pulled out a business card and handed it to Rebecca. I run a nonprofit now. We help people navigate prescription assistance programs, connect them with patient advocacy groups, teach them how to talk to their doctors about cost concerns. We've helped over 3,000 families in the last decade. I can't bring my father back. But I can make sure other people don't have to make the choice I made. Dr. Phil looked at the card, then at Carol, and something shifted in his expression, recognition of someone who had turned their deepest shame into purposeful action. Rebecca, Dr. Phil said, his voice still firm but with a thread of something else now, not forgiveness, but perhaps the possibility of eventual redemption. You're going to face legal consequences for this. That's non-negotiable. But after you've accepted accountability, after you've faced whatever justice the legal system demands, you're going to have a choice about who you become. He picked up the prescription bottles from the table and held them in front of Rebecca. These bottles represent the worst decision you ever made. But they don't have to define the rest of your life. Carol has shown you one path forward. Whether you take it or not is up to you. But first, you have to stop running from what you did. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Security had arrived by now, along with the show's legal team. Dr. Phil spoke quietly with them, showing them the prescription bottles and the pharmacy receipt. Phone calls were made. Notes were taken. Jennifer sat motionless in her chair, watching her sister begin to face consequences that were 12 years overdue. When Dr. Phil approached her, his voice was gentle. Jennifer, you've carried this knowledge alone for over a decade. That's a tremendous burden. And I want you to know that seeking justice for your mother is not betrayal, it's love. Jennifer nodded, tears finally streaming down her face. I just wanted my sister back. But I wanted my mother more. You can't have your mother back, Dr. Phil said simply. And you may never have your sister back the way she was. But you can have the truth. And sometimes, that's the only closure we get. The cameras never turned back on that day. The episode was never aired. But Dr. Phil made sure that both sisters, and Carol, were connected with the resources they needed. Jennifer was referred to grief counseling specifically for families dealing with loss complicated by betrayal. Rebecca was connected with legal aid and eventually, after serving probation and community service for involuntary manslaughter, she began volunteering with Carol's nonprofit. 3 years later, Dr. Phil received a letter. It was from Jennifer. She wrote about the long, painful process of grief, not just for her mother, but for the sister she thought she knew. She wrote about therapy, about learning that healing doesn't mean forgetting, and about how she had finally been able to visit her mother's grave without the weight of unspoken truth crushing her. And at the bottom of the letter was a photograph. It showed Jennifer and Rebecca standing together at a prescription assistance event, wearing matching volunteer t-shirts for Carol's nonprofit. They weren't embracing. They weren't smiling broadly. But they were standing side by side, and that was something. Dr. Phil kept that photograph in his office, tucked into the frame of his diploma from the University of North Texas. It reminded him why he did this work. Not for the dramatic revelations or the television moments, but for the possibility that even the most broken things could find a way to become whole again, even if they never looked the same. The envelope Carol had given Rebecca that day remained a symbol, not of what was lost, but of what could still be built from the ruins of devastating mistakes. And in the years that followed, whenever Dr. Phil encountered a case involving family secrets that had festered in silence, he thought of that Tuesday taping, the day he stopped the cameras and chose humanity over television, accountability over spectacle, and the hard truth over comfortable lies. Because some moments are too important to be reduced to entertainment. Some truths are too sacred to be packaged neatly for commercial breaks. And some families need justice more than they need resolution. That day in the studio taught everyone present that real healing doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in the thousands of small choices that follow, the choice to face truth, to seek help, to transform shame into service, and to understand that redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about building something better from its pieces.